So, Victor, then to come to the next few months, as you've said, the next 100 days will be of breathtaking significance for America and for the world, quite frankly. I think you wrote that it was almost the surprise was not that Trump won, it was that it took so long for something like that to happen. I suppose another way of putting that is to say Trump's not the problem. Trump was the product of the problem. That I think you also described him uniquely as perhaps chemotherapy. The patient was in such a bad way we had to take on something very tough and unusual that we knew might be unpleasant. How do you see it now, as you sit there?
I see it pretty much the same way. I've used the tragic hero from Sophoclean tragedy analogy, or the Great Western of John Wayne and the Searchers, or Shane, or High Noon. That he's a person without military or political experience. He's uncouth. He can be very crude. And he came in with a certain set of skills, or no investment in the bipartisan establishment, and therefore no worry about what they thought of him. And he wanted to get an agenda. And yet he's now learning that even before these three crises, that the more he was succeeding, the more people hated him. And the people I've talked to around him, and I've talked to him too, and it seems that I think he has to be aware that when this is all over, people are not going to like him, and they're never going to like him. And he's going to be a gunfire that people say, you used a gun to clean up the town, now will you leave? And that's the dilemma of where he is. But he can do a lot of good still, and he's done a lot of good. And if we had not had that type of person at this late date, I don't know what we would have done. And what it means in foreign policy is that he's talked a lot. If you distill what he's saying, is that he's very skeptical of Europe. He's almost suicidally pro-Australian, pro-British. He wants to be pro-Canadian. And he really believes that the Anglo-speaking world and the traditions of England especially that we all share are unique, and yet to say that in this climate is suicidal, because it is demagogued as being racist. But it's not. He's trying to say that all of us of every race have a lot to learn from the British system. And so and he's very pro-Japanese. I guess what he's sort of like, he reminds me of a phrase that Sulla borrowed. Sulla was not a good guy in Roman Republican history, but he said, no better friend, no worse enemy. If he thinks you're a friend of the United States, I think that there's no better president to come to your aid. If he feels that, I think, and I'll be candid, I think he feels, for a variety of historical and contemporary reasons, that Germany is now not an ally of the United States. It is a de jure ally, but it's not. And so I feel that relationship on both sides is seriously in jeopardy, and I mean permanently, unless something's done. And that's tragic, but he feels that, and yet I feel that his relationships with our traditional allies, Britain especially, but Australia especially, and he wants to be that way with Canada and Japan and South Korea, and Taiwan and Israel have never been better. And I think when you go to these countries, a lot of the times people recognize that, at least privately. But when the left has a minority of the demography still, but it controls the foundations, it controls the media, the universities, the popular culture, Hollywood. So it magnifies its importance. It's got a much bigger megaphone.
That's certainly true in Australia. Around a third of Australians now self-identify as left-wing, and that's up considerably on what it used to be. But it means that 2/3 do not. Yet virtually all of the public commentary, the people with the megaphones, come from that particular perspective and have a great deal of say. The future of, on this issue of American attitudes towards Trump, I recently met an American from the East Coast, and she started to almost froth at the mouth at the mere mention of Trump's name, and listed an unbelievable set of real and imagined ills. She said to me then, how do you feel about him as an Australian? And I said, well, one thing I will say is that he had the courage to call out the Chinese were much closer to China than you, and Obama did nothing about the militarization of the islands that are not in Chinese territory. And at that point, she immediately backed off, and it was quite interesting and said, yes, I will give you that. I thought it was a very interesting remark or insight.
The left is in a dilemma because some of them had been solitary voices complaining about human rights, Hong Kong, Tibet, Uyghurs. And Obama was not interested in that at all. His Asian pivot was not anti-China, it was pro-China. And Trump came along and he empowered those people. So it's very funny to see people who are now coming out of the woodwork from the left, and they all have to throat clear before they make their statements. And they say, well, I hate Donald Trump and he's no good, just what you're talking about. But he allowed us to speak about Chinese human rights violations. And so that's something that's important. But what you're also describing is in the United States, a lot of us, I know that I've had a lot of friends and family that don't speak to him anymore because I wrote a book on how Trump won. And they have created a climate that it's not socially done. If I were to put on a MAGA hat, Make America Great, and put American sticker in my car and drive to town, I'd be in trouble. That being said, some of the people who shout at me might, in fact, when they get into the ballot box, vote for Trump. And I think that's the big unknown. How many of them in the fall? I talked to a person yesterday, Mexican-American fellow, law enforcement. And I said, so who are you voting for? Trump. I said, well, have you ever been contacted? He said, yes. I said, who do you say you're voting for? He said, Biden. And I said, why? He said, because if they text me a question, I'm going to be on some list, and they're going to go after me. And that's not crazy anymore in this climate. So there are little telltale signs. We had a congressional special election for somebody who was removed from Congress in a plus 12 Democratic seat about 2 months ago. And we had a conservative Mexican-American candidate who was down in the polls supposedly by 8 points, and he won by 10. So
it actually happened here last year with the re-election of Scott Morrison as Prime Minister. He was given no chance. The polls all got it wrong. Even the US Study Centre, no one there seemed to call it right in relation to Trump. And you've got this quite distinct reality now that a lot of people simply won't tell you what they really think. That in itself is profoundly troubling. We now feel obliged not only to hide what we really think, but to deny it in public. And so my final question, you've been very generous with your time. A decent middle American worried about their country, just wanting a return to some degree of civility, what advice would you have for them? Because the same will apply in my country.
Well, I think, and this is kind of contrarian or counterfactual, or I don't think that appeasement and abasement work anymore. In other words, I think people like yourself who said to the American, well, he's been pretty good on China. We need to be a little bit more assertive. And we need to have people in Middle America that say, you know what, I'm not going to defund the police. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to do it. And you know what, I'm not going to allow you to tear down Father Junipio Serra's statue. And if they stand up, they don't need to do it acrimoniously or rudely, but they have to be much more forceful, because you mentioned these revolutions. They all had one thing in common. They started out with a minority of the population. The Jacobins were a minority. The Bolsheviks were a minority. The Maoists were a minority. And everybody said they're going to devour their own, and they did. And they're going to dilute their message, and they did. And they're going to be suicidal, and they were, but they won, at least for a time, because nobody spoke out against them, either in fear or because they thought they had no chance. And we're going to wait and see what happens in November to finish. And there's 3 or 4 things that we don't know what's going to happen. Either the virus is going to wane. If it wanes by November, Trump will be elected. If the lockdown stops and the economy starts to show real signs of recovery, he'll win. If Joe Biden gets out on the trail and he seems to be cognitively impaired in some degree, Trump will win. And if Trump has a greater degree of discipline in his expressions, he'll win. If that does not happen, he'll lose. And so we're all waiting to see which of those 4 or 5 factors will play out and how they will play out. But they're on everybody's mind, and they govern every policy decision, every editorial interpretation of them. We just, unfortunately, everything is weaponized in this country. I've never seen anything like it. And I grew up in the 60s, and it was not, even that was not like this. It's scary. But civilization, I really believe, is on the brink, because if these forces come to full power, they're going to be taking names, and they're not going to want a union of thought. They're not going to be gracious about their victory. They're not going to want unity and healing. They want to hunt out and eradicate their opponents. That's what cultural revolutions always do, and they'll do it again.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.